You've also got the UK and the US and Russia all in the mix there at different
Yeah.
times, and even switching sides at different times. It's fun.
Oh, so fun. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Caitlin Howarth with me, who's the project director of conflict analysis programs at the Yale School of Public Health. We're going to be talking about what's going on in Sudan. It is a crisis. It's horrible. And unfortunately, I don't think it's getting enough coverage and attention. So, Caitlin, really happy to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Before we begin, what are we drinking?
I've got my go-to drink here, a Negroni.
Ooh, nice. You just whipped that up really fast. I'm very impressed.
It's dead easy to
I
make.
have an Angry Orchard hard cider. It's a classic, but cheers.
Nice. Cheers.
So the question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
I genuinely don't think you should trust me as an individual, but I hope that you trust my evidence. So
I love that.
yeah,
I love evidence. It's my favorite. So there's a lot. It's a very complex and very complicated situation. And for people that are unaware, there was like a huge civil war that happened between Sudan and South Sudan, maybe like 10-ish years ago, a little bit before that, 20 years ago, and then ended in the split of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011, I believe.
Mhm.
And now
Yep.
we're in a different, I would also argue, type of civil war, but just going on in Sudan. Could you provide some insight into this current war and what's going on?
Sure. So that partition between Sudan and South Sudan is actually the moment when I first started working in the Sudanese context. So that was back in the very end of 2010, going into 2011, when South Sudan became a country. There was a whole referendum, very carefully negotiated. And there was a lot of contested territory along the south of Sudan, in Abyei, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. And my team and I, many of which the original members are still part of our current team at Yale, we started using the methods that we are still using today. But back then, they were really brand new. And where we are today, where Sudan has come a huge way in many regards, but has also a lot of things have really gone in the wrong direction. So we have seen that multiple factions, especially within the military, have kind of ripped the country apart. But it's important to keep in mind this wouldn't be possible without the sponsorship of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, all taking sides and all providing crucial international backing to these actors. So the RSF, which is what came from what used to be called the Janjaweed, itself an outgrowth of the Sudanese Armed Forces, that wouldn't be possible. And it certainly wouldn't be able to do as much as it is today with drones and really high-tech weaponry without the financial sponsorship and technical expertise being provided by the UAE. And likewise, Sudanese Armed Forces really wouldn't be where it is without the support of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So there's a lot going on as proxy conflict between those powers against each other. But the ones that are caught in the middle, the Sudanese people, who successfully held an incredible revolution to try and get rid of El-Fasher, the one-time dictator, who was really holding everyone down and keeping the country back. And now they are the ones who are losing the most and who are being, I think intentionally, kept away from the negotiating table again and again and again.
Interesting. So this began in around April of 2023.
Yes. Closer to March, but yes.
Okay, March.
Mhm.
What started this? And what if and I mean, it's been brutal and deadly, and I think it's one of the greatest like conflicts of displacement at the moment as well. What started it?
that's a super complex question. And so I'm going to give a really unsatisfying answer, um, where I will say, for any Sudanese person who's connected to your podcast, I'm just going to own this upright. I am not going to give the correct answer to this because there are so many different aspects to it. Light touch. What started this was that Burhan, the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Hemeti, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, these two had originally been, they were together and sort of ostensibly leading in what had been effectively like a junta government in the aftermath of the People's Revolution of Sudan. That junta broke apart. And so that's what happened in 2023. The junta went to war within itself. And so now it was RSF against SAF.
So it's basically, it's the like Sudanese military versus a paramilitary force.
Correct.
And the paramilitary force, the RSF, is funded by the UAE.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the Sudanese military that is funded by Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. What could be easier?
Yeah. You've also got the UK and the US and Russia all in the mix there at different times, and even switching sides at different times. It's fun.
Oh, so fun. Incredible. Love to see it. This has been an extremely horrific and very deadly conflict. Just looking at recent numbers, I think over 150,000 people have died, 12 million are displaced. And as of late, there was a huge crisis in El-Fasher, where the RSF basically overtook and, created a barrier around the city and wouldn't let anyone leave and wouldn't let food get in. And people just starved to death. And
Yeah.
it was not being discussed. And then they went in and then killed everyone and bombed everything that tried to leave. And the stories that are coming out of it are absolutely horrific.
Mm-hmm.
You do a lot of really interesting work with satellites and imaging and trying to gather the evidence and showing what's going on. Can you describe how what you're doing has played into showing the ways that the RSF has committed crimes?
Sure. So what my team and I have been doing now, and throughout the 18 months that RSF has been conducting its siege against El-Fasher, which started in April of 2024. We have documented through the review of anything that we were able to gather through open source media. So that's anything in social media, any statements that were being put out by different forces. We also work to gather field source material. We have some contacts, but we were very careful about not revealing any names or the names of any of those. We cross corroborate all of that with satellite imagery, which we obtain through these are commercial companies. So it's not quite free. It's not like looking it up on Google Earth Pro. But it is, if you've got a credit card and a dream, you too can do this. So what we do is every day, week after week, we are looking for every location and particularly focusing around El-Fasher and especially around the villages around El-Fasher. And what we documented was how the RSF steadily, what they did was they approached their location, their target population, like a hyena. And so they would start burning the outer villages in order to drive the population of Zagawa and Fur, all of these indigenous communities that are non-Arab, into El-Fasher itself and sort of push them into one central location, basically creating what would ultimately be their kill box. And so they burn those villages down, they attack, they push everyone in closer and closer. Eventually they got hundreds of thousands of people in Zamzam internally displaced persons camp. Then they attacked that. Those who were able to get out of Zamzam, many of them went into El-Fasher. And then in El-Fasher, it became this war of the siege of attrition, right, with starvation tactics. And so you had all access to food was cut off, access to medicines, everything was cut off. And then around June and July, the RSF started to build this berm, which is this massive, like 9-foot high earthen wall. Usually that's like a defensive fortification. But in this case, what they built was an open air prison around the city with only 5 exit points. This is a city that had previously held the rough population estimates we had before all of this in April 2024 was 1.5 million people in El-Fasher and Zamzam. By the time El-Fasher finally fell, and so on the 26th of October, the estimate is that only about 260,000 people were left. And that's through a combination of people fleeing while they still could, but also attrition due to starvation, death through the constant bombardment, fighting between Sudanese Armed Forces and RSF, drone attacks. I mean, this has just been a massive, massive decline in the population. And what we're seeing now since the 26th is that largely due to that berm, in previous attacks, like when RSF took over Zamzam camp, which had a comparable number of people in it, we believe, at the time that it was overrun. At that time, we saw huge convoys of people on the roads. We were able to track them with the satellite imagery. We're not seeing that. We're not seeing the evidence of people escaping. What we are seeing are mass graves. We are seeing piles of what we think are objects that look like they have the dimensions of human bodies. We're seeing these huge discolorations in the earth that the color is what we call a true red in the imagery, and that's likely to be blood. I'm cautious with my language because I have to be. As an analyst, there's always what we can say, and then there's what we have to cross corroborate with ultimately forensics, ground footage, video. And we're cautious for a reason, because we want this material to be used by the courts. The ICC just was very clear in their recent statement that they are going to use material that's submitted to them to bring cases forward. And they still have essentially open jurisdiction over any potential crimes against humanity, potential war crimes that are committed in Darfur. So all of these would apply.
That's horrific. And I've been seeing a lot of reports of gender-based violence as well. It's been a really, really upsetting. Why are all of these external countries involved in this?
So despite the fact that a lot of people may not realize it, Sudan actually is known as the breadbasket of the Horn of Africa. It has a huge amount of resources in terms of both its production capacity. One of the most critical things that it produces is a thing called gum arabica, which I would almost guarantee that everyone who's listening or watching this podcast, you've all had it because you've probably had a Coke. Gum arabica is one of the most commonly used things in so many different products, and Sudan is by far the chief producer of it in the world. So if you can't get access to gum arabica, Coca-Cola becomes really, really hard to produce and much more expensive. And you would all notice as consumers, if your Coca-Cola suddenly costs you like $5 to get a single can of it, versus like $1.25, which is close to what it costs here where I am in New Haven. There's also another critical thing, especially in Darfur, which are gold mines. And this is something that the UAE also has a chief interest in. The UAE is one of, if not the world's leading gold exporter, trader. And this is a really critical resource, not only for the obvious value of gold, but when you have global markets that are as changeable as our markets have been recently, gold is the resource that every government likes to back up and guarantee its treasury against. So the value of gold has gone up enormously, especially in recent days. So it's gold is also one of the few things that you can essentially completely launder. So it's incredibly hard to trace once it has been cleaned through the refinery process. So unlike diamonds, which can be traced to their point of origin, gold, once it goes through that refinery, nice and clean as a whistle. Easier than cash, easier than so many other forms of currency.
Fascinating. So there's arguments that the UAE is supporting the RSF because of wanting them to be in power and they can have access to their gold resources.
Absolutely. But also access to all of their other key minerals and trade. There's also a good argument when you look at we're concerned about spillover effects. There's really important tensions that are brewing again in Ethiopia and the Tigray region, between Ethiopia and Eritrea. All of this stuff is connected. So we're really worried about a broader regional war that could be brewing.
Wow. And for a friendly reminder for people, the MBS, the Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of the UAE, is going to visit Trump next week. So on a whole host of other human rights violations that has been done under his watch. Can add this to the list as well.
Oh, yeah. But I also want to stress that, and this is something that is really important to me. So the UAE was made a super ally under the Biden administration. And while we were in the midst of documenting all of this, we issued our first warnings about what we said would happen in El-Fasher in July of 2023 to the US government.
That's horrific.
And then it was after that happened that the US, but at that point, the US was already on track to create this special designation. This is a designation that, by the way, only exists for the UAE and India related to the US government. And it is of massive importance when it comes to the kinds of weapons, the kinds of bases that can be created, essentially the significance of information and the defense relationship that's being set up between the two countries. So if you are thinking about how the UAE is working to position itself as a counterpoint to Saudi Arabia, and how the US might have an interest in having a counterpoint to Saudi Arabia in the region, some of these moves might start to make some sense.
Interesting. So who controls Darfur?
Right now, there are still some areas that are ostensibly under Sudanese Armed Forces control. If you look, there are some great maps that have been created by some other analysts, but at this point, effectively, with the fall of El-Fasher, El-Fasher is like the linchpin. It is the major city that connects everything else. So right now, Darfur is effectively controlled by the Rapid Support Forces.
I saw some reports, and you also mentioned that it was religious-based violence, that the RSF was going after non-Arab populations.
So it's more ethnic.
Okay. Because I also saw reports of like people being let out of one of those like 5 checkpoints just purely based off the color of their skin. If they were lighter skinned, they were able to go. And if they weren't, they were forced to stay.
So there's the level of the degree to which people are being let go, or most of what we have seen has been consistent with people being allowed to move through if they were able to successfully pay an exit tax. So it's more that they're being stripped of everything and that the payments went through. Now, I won't disagree that colorism or tribal affiliation may also have something to do with it, but it's more on a case by case basis. But in most cases, what we've been seeing is that everyone essentially is having to pay some tax. What we have seen, and this is, I think, across the board, something that needs to be clear, is that religion really is not the factor, especially in Darfur. This is about non-Arab and Arab affiliated tribes, indigenous versus non-indigenous, and it really but everyone, pretty much all of these are Muslim practicing. So there isn't like a Muslim sect division either, Shia versus Sunni. That's really not an issue.
It's so fascinating. It's so, like, any type of just violence is so upsetting. And then you dive down into this and it's just feels like such a conflict that has just not been part of the mainstream news in the way that I think it needs to be.
It really isn't. And it certainly isn't the way that especially Darfur was, and the genocide in Darfur was from like 2003 to 2005. This was one of the leading issues in the United States. If you were doing anything in foreign policy, you had to be aware of and really conversant in what was going on here. The Bush administration was on top of this. And today, both with the Biden administration and the Trump administration, not only is it not something that they want to talk about, but I think it was very intentionally set to be like, we don't want this on anyone's agenda.
So interesting. So what are you seeing now? Where are things at now based on your satellite imagery and other analysis?
Right now, what we're seeing is that RSF has been very busy in cleanup operations. There are a lot of bodies that they've been working their way through. Those bodies have to go somewhere. Many of them have also been moved into some outer areas. So we've been keeping a very close eye on this outer village called Garni, where a large number of people were moved from El-Fasher and they were transported there to Garni. We have had some confirmations, including in some BBC reporting that came out earlier today, that confirmed what we've been hearing, that men and boys have been very systematically separated and executed. Which again is really concerning us. But largely speaking, we're not seeing a lot of convoys coming out. And we're concerned that, again, the vast majority of that 260,000 people left have largely been sort of contained still within El-Fasher itself. And so far, I've been asking, our team has been looking for signs of what we call pattern of life, indications that markets are open, that, there's some movement around the city, sort of normal traffic. And I don't think we're seeing that. So reports from the RSF that say, hey, life is happening as usual. That's what we're seeing does not show us that that's actually happening. What we are also seeing is that those who have made it to places like Tooele and Malit, these are outer sort of safe havens, they are under enormous strain. These are places where the critical thing is water. The aquifers are really limited, so they need to get as much humanitarian aid as possible to support the IDP populations that have shown up, make sure that they're able to access all of the medical aid, because people are showing up, the ones who managed to make it, they're still being set upon even after they get out. They're being attacked once they're on the roads. So a lot of them, if they do survive the journey, they're showing up with bullet wounds. There's a lot of kids that are showing up without anyone else. So they need a lot. They need a lot of support.
That's so beyond upsetting. And especially because the international community is certainly not taking really any steps, it seems like, to try to apply pressure and end what's going on. What what calls do you have to like the international community?
Well, we're seeing some stuff that seems to be working. Um, so what we are seeing is that the connective tissue between the RSF and the UAE, that has gotten really sticky, and the UAE is not pleased. So Mohammed bin Zayed and MBS, they do care that their reputation is tied to genocide. They care that the RSF that they have been fans of putting themselves on camera while they are conducting executions. And if I can be a little graphic for a moment, my apologies if this is too much. Earmuff it for a second, take your earbuds out. But they've documented themselves doing horrific things, with like stringing people up and hanging them and then driving around with the hanging bodies on the backs of trucks. These are not kind people. And the extent of the cruelty of their crimes goes quite far. That means that it is, though, very difficult for them to deny the reality of just how of sort of the viciousness, and the fact that each of those videos means that reputationally their sponsor in the UAE is taking a bigger and bigger hit. So that makes it tougher to do things like have sponsorship of like a gigantic NBA tournament, or to be for Manchester City to be out playing all of its regular games in the Premier League without comment. So it's those things where the everyday person, not necessarily the diplomat who is constrained by their government, but where the average person is actually able to hold up a sign, to yell out their displeasure, to comment on social media. These are the things where we're actually not only seeing some change, but we're seeing results, because our team has been seeing a lot more pushback. And even in terms of like disinformation campaigns, that has been ticking up a lot. And I know it may not sound like a good thing, but it kind of is, because it means for the first time, there are the different actors involved here think that this is hurting them enough that they have to actually maybe cover their tracks. Yeah. So if they now think that they have to attack us as the ones doing the documentation, I'm thrilled, because that means they're worried. So all I can say is, for everybody who's listening, who cares and is paying attention, you can speak up, you can make a difference. And you doing something, I know it might seem small, like calling your congressman, but doing those things actually does make a difference. There are a handful of people like Representative Sarah Jacobs, who has been one of the key voices and one of the constant voices on this issue for months and months and months. But she's, kind of out there on her own, doing a lot of this work. But calling her up and saying thank you and saying, how else can we help? That makes a difference. But also calling up your own member and saying, why aren't you standing with her? This is such an obvious thing that you should be doing. And also, why is this something where we're being silent on an obvious genocide that the US even declared a genocide? We declared it a genocide in January of 2024. So what's the issue?
It's so upsetting. Such a fucked up conflict with such brutality. It's so upsetting. So upsetting.
Yeah. I think that it's really hard sometimes when things are so bleak to believe in what is possible. What's possible is accountability. What's possible are sanctions. What's possible, we've seen there is a member of the RSF, formerly, actually, at the time it was Janjaweed, who right now is in The Hague, successfully convicted because the tides changed. Things got too uncomfortable where he was. He felt unsafe and he actually turned himself in. So here's the thing. Today, it might feel impossible that things will ever change or that anyone will ever face justice. Tomorrow may be different. So by doing the work, by speaking up, and also by making all of these parties, all of these different actors, whether it's, if you're upset about how the Sudanese Armed Forces have irresponsibly bombed over certain communities in Khartoum and Omdurman while they were going after RSF, which is absolutely not something they should have done. If you want to go after the UAE for their sponsorship of the RSF, then go after the companies that they're affiliated with, go after their reputation. These things do make a difference. And bit by bit, we are actually making a change. So, and like I said, you can just know that when you see groups like mine coming under attack, that's actually a sign that it's working. So try to not get discouraged by it. Wear it with pride.
So important. Such a great note to end on. And also, friendly reminder for people that USAID being cut has seriously fucked over all of these IDPs, these internally displaced persons you were just mentioning. So
Yes,
being able, I think, to provide monetary support if you're able to is also a really great way to try to help people that are in a really shit situation from no doing of their own.
absolutely. There's a couple organizations I would really strongly recommend that people support. The ERRs, emergency response rooms, are doing phenomenal work. You can find them. They're basically supported through if you look up Mutual Aid Sudan, you should find ways to support them. It's all extremely well vetted. All of their support was originally vetted through the U.S. State Department. So I can assure you that money will get there, and it will get there safely and in a way that is secure for you, as well as secure for them. Another fantastic organization is Nonviolent Peace Force. They are on the ground. They're doing amazing work with communities in Sudan. And they're also doing just some of the best work in terms of making sure that aid gets where it needs to be. Norwegian Refugee Council is also on the ground in Sudan and has done, for my money, some of the best and most consistent advocacy on behalf of the Sudanese people. And so, yeah, if you want 3 picks, those would be my 3.
Great recommendations. Thank you. Caitlin, thank you so much for shedding light on this topic that absolutely needs to be getting more attention.
Thank you so much. And thanks for giving me an excuse to have a drink while I talk about it.
Anytime. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.